Okay, welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're diving into a concept presented in the source material you shared with us, something the source calls the science of human pressure.
Right. And it's really important to understand right away, as the source clarifies, this isn't like, chemistry or physics, a formal science you'd study in school.
Okay.
Instead, it's framed more as a lens, a framework for looking at the entire human experience. It's about studying the fundamental forces, internal and external, that, well, push and pull us, that compel change, shape our behavior, and, ultimately define our existence.
Got it. So we're definitely not just talking about blood pressure here, then.
No, not at all.
The source seems to argue this pressure is multifaceted, operating across pretty much every conceivable scale and aspect of life.
Exactly. From the subatomic level right up to the cosmic.
Wow.
And from our basic biological drives to, well, really complex philosophical dilemmas.
And the source presents it as absolutely universal, something impacting everyone, regardless of gender, age, culture, history.
That's the idea. It's presented as a constant, really.
Yeah.
So our mission, I guess, in this deep dive is to analyze this concept from the sources you provided.
Okay.
We'll try to pick apart its different elements, explore the incredible range of ways it seems to affect individuals and communities, examine how the world appears to respond to it, touch on some ideas the source has for maybe navigating it,
Right.
and see what paths forward this unique perspective might suggest. We're here to help you analyze, understand, and make sense of this complex system as the source lays it out.
Okay, sounds good. Let's unpack this concept then. If it's a science or at least a lens, how does the source categorize the types of pressure we experience?
Well, the source basically breaks it down into two main categories. First, there are what it calls natural pressures. These are the fundamental inherent forces, things in the universe, and our own biology.
Like laws of physics, that kind of thing.
Exactly. Laws of gravity, thermodynamics, but also the evolutionary drive baked into our DNA, to survive and reproduce. Our basic biological needs, food, water, safety, and, well, the undeniable realities of aging and mortality. These are forces we didn't create. They just are.
Right. They're built in.
Built in. Then the second type are human-created pressures.
Ah, okay.
These emerge from our collective and individual consciousness, our interactions, our societies. This is where you see the massive influence of culture, societal expectations.
Politics, economics.
Precisely. Political systems, economic forces, religious beliefs, family dynamics, workplace competition, community norms, even the weight of our own personal ambitions, our desires, our fears.
So one is sort of inherent to existing, the other is built by us through our interactions.
That's a good way to put it.
And the source says this overall concept of pressure has been a universal constant throughout human history. It's always been there.
Absolutely. The sources really emphasize this isn't new. It's always been shaping us. It's just that we might not always recognize it as this, single overarching phenomenon.
It does sound incredibly broad, though. How does the source illustrate this influence across so many different fields of knowledge? It feels like it touches on almost everything you can study.
It really does, and I think that's part of the point of framing it as this pervasive lens. The source pulls from a, frankly, surprising range of disciplines to show how this idea of pressure manifests.
Like what?
Well, it starts with physics and mathematics. Think about the basic definition of pressure in physics. Force over area. P equals F over A.
Right.
The source uses this almost as a metaphor, suggesting that even large-scale human dynamics can be viewed as forces acting on individuals or groups, the areas.
Okay, so it's like scaling up that basic physical idea, forces pushing on surfaces, but applied to people and societies.
Kind of, yeah. And then mathematics provides models for how these forces might play out dynamically. The source brings in things like game theory.
Oh, right. Analyzing strategic interactions.
Exactly. When individuals or groups are under pressure to make choices, often with conflicting interests.
Like the prisoner's dilemma, where acting in your own self-interest under pressure leads to a worse outcome for everyone involved.
Precisely. The source uses that as an example of how pressure to prioritize, say, personal short-term gain can lead to these suboptimal collective results.
Okay.
They also mention network theory.
How things spread through connections.
Yeah, how things like social pressures, ideas, even behaviors spread through connections in a system. A bit like how information or even a virus moves through a social network.
Ah, so pressure doesn't just exist in one place, it transmits through our connections.
Right, it propagates, it spreads, and then there's chaos theory.
The butterfly effect.
That's the one. The study of complex systems where tiny changes can have massive, unpredictable consequences. The source suggests human societies are highly chaotic systems,
Makes sense.
where seemingly small events or localized pressures can trigger huge cascading effects throughout the whole system.
Wow, okay. Seeing human interaction through the lens of physics and complex math models is, well, it's a really thought-provoking angle the source takes.
It is.
What about the biological side? How does pressure show up in our bodies, our genes?
Right, moving to biology and genetics. Here, the most fundamental pressure the source highlights is that evolutionary imperative, survive and reproduce. Our biology itself is, in a way, a product of billions of years of environmental pressures.
So the pressures shaped us.
Deeply. The source argues that our DNA is essentially a historical record of the pressures our ancestors faced. Genes that gave a survival advantage under those pressures were the ones that got passed down.
So our genetic makeup is literally shaped by ancestral pressures.
That's the argument, yes. And then on an individual level, you have the stress response, that automatic fight-or-flight reaction.
Adrenaline, cortisol.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Mediated by hormones like adrenaline and cortisol, it's a biological adaptation designed to help us handle acute physical pressure, like facing a predator.
What?
But the source points out that the chronic, often non-physical pressures of modern life, constant deadlines, social media worries, economic anxiety, they keep this system activated way too often.
Which isn't good long-term.
No, it leads to significant long-term health issues.
Yeah.
Cardiovascular problems, weakened immune systems, things like that.
And this ties into epigenetics somehow.
It does.
Yeah.
This field, epigenetics, is fascinating. It shows that our experiences, especially things like prolonged exposure to pressure or stress, can leave these little marks on our DNA.
Not changing the genes themselves, but how they work.
Exactly. Not changing the sequence, but changing how our genes are expressed, effectively turning genes on or off. The source highlights this as a powerful example of how external pressure can leave a physical, biological imprint. And sometimes these marks can even be passed down to the next generation.
So pressure isn't just in our minds or society. It can literally alter our biology, even how our genes function. That's a really profound connection the source is drawing.
It is quite profound, yeah.
What about our inner world then? Our thoughts, our feelings. How does pressure work there according to this model?
Okay, so that falls under what the source groups as philosophy, logic, and state behind. The idea here is that the very emergence of consciousness introduced a unique kind of pressure.
How so?
Well, there's what they call existential pressure, that sort of background anxiety that comes with our freedom, knowing we're mortal, and the challenge of creating meaning in a universe that doesn't just hand us answers.
Right. The big questions, stuff philosophers like Sartre and Camus grappled with.
Exactly those kinds. Then there's logical pressure. Our minds naturally seek consistency, coherence.
Okay.
So when our beliefs or our attitudes or our actions are in conflict with each other, we experience what's called cognitive dissonance.
Ah, that uncomfortable feeling when things don't line up.
Precisely. And that feeling is itself an internal pressure, motivating us to change something, either our belief or our action, to get back to a state of coherence.
That definitely feels like internal pressure. We've all felt that, I think.
I think so. And the source also discusses broader psychological pressure. This includes both external forces pushing on us and how we internalize them.
Examples?
Well, they reference classic studies, like the Asch experiments on conformity.
When people denied what they saw just to fit in with the group.
Yes, that powerful pressure to conform. And the Milgram experiment, showing the pressure to obey authority figures, even when it goes against your own moral judgments.
Chilling stuff.
It really is.
Yeah.
And they also highlight internalized pressure, the expectations and standards we absorb from society and then place on ourselves. Ideals of success, appearance, perfectionism.
Leading to anxiety, burnout, pressure we put on ourselves.
Exactly.
It's wild how these pressures are both coming at us and also generated within us.
Yeah.
Thinking about those external forces, what about how pressure operates in groups, in society and culture?
Right. That brings us to belief systems, society, and culture. And here, a major force is the pressure to belong, to be accepted within a group or community.
The need to fit in.
Pretty much. Social norms and traditions are essentially these unwritten rules that exert pressure to conform. If you violate them, you risk social sanctions, anything from mild disapproval to, well, being ostracized. But religion and ideology, they provide frameworks for understanding the world, right? But they also create pressure to adhere to specific doctrines, rituals, moral codes. And finally, you have law and ethics. These represent more formalized systems of pressure. Laws are codified societal pressures enforced by the state,
Right.
while ethics represent the sort of moral pressures that guide individual and collective decision-making, often based on shared values or principles.
Okay, so this science of human pressure concept really does seem to span everything from physics formulas to our deepest anxieties and how we organize ourselves in groups. It's a lot,
A broad framework.
which leads to something really interesting. If these pressures are so powerful, so fundamental, shaping our biology, our minds, our societies, why do humans so often seem to act against them? Why do we break the rules, defy expectations, or make choices that don't seem logical given all these pressures?
Yeah, that's a crucial point the source gets into, and it really boils down to the complexity of our minds and the systems we've built. One key reason is the constant conflict of pressures. We're very rarely under just one pressure at a time.
True.
We might feel the pressure to be, say, financially successful, but also the pressure to maintain our personal integrity. Or the pressure to provide for our family might conflict with the pressure to protect the environment. Our choices often involve trying to prioritize or somehow navigate these competing forces.
So it's a balancing act, or sometimes just picking one pressure over another?
Often, yeah. Then there's the whole issue of short-term versus long-term thinking. Our brains, for deep evolutionary reasons, are often wired to prioritize immediate rewards and threats over distant future consequences.
The here and now feels more urgent.
Exactly. This present bias, as it's sometimes called, makes it really difficult to act effectively on long-term pressures, even when we rationally understand their importance. Things like saving for retirement, or addressing climate change, or even just sticking to a healthy diet.
So the pressure of now often outweighs the pressure of later, even if later is objectively more important.
It often seems to, yes. Another factor the source highlights is our inherent desire for autonomy.
Wanting to be in control.
Right. Even though there's all this pressure to conform, we also have this deep psychological need for self-determination, for freedom. The source notes that when our freedom feels threatened,
We push back.
we can experience what's called psychological reactance,
Yeah.
a strong motivation to rebel, to do the opposite of what's being pushed on us, sometimes even if it's not really in our best interest logically.
Interesting. Just reacting against the pressure itself.
It can be, yeah. And finally, the source brings up the idea of evolutionary mismatch.
What's that?
The idea that our modern world, with its super rapid technological changes, information overload, complex abstract social structures, has changed far, far faster than our underlying biology has had time to adapt.
Our brains are running old software on new hardware, basically.
That's a decent analogy. The pressures of the digital age, for instance, constant connectivity, social comparison, information floods, are very different from the pressures our ancestors evolved over millennia to handle. And this mismatch, the source suggests, contributes to a lot of modern phenomena like chronic stress, anxiety, maybe even some maladaptive coping behaviors.
So we're navigating this ancient wiring in a completely new, incredibly pressure-filled environment. That makes sense?
It seems to resonate.
So, okay, with all these complex, often conflicting forces swirling around us and inside us, how can you, the listener, navigate this landscape more effectively? And maybe more importantly, how can understanding this science help us build something better for ourselves and maybe for society?
Well, the source proposes that a really critical tool for navigating all this is systemic thinking.
Thinking about the whole system, not just isolated parts.
Exactly. Shifting from seeing events or problems in isolation to viewing the world as these interconnected systems. Understanding the ripple effects, the feedback loops, how different pressures within the system interact and influence each other.
Can you give an example?
Sure. The source uses the example of crime. A non-systemic approach might just focus on punishment, a direct response to the pressure of law breaking.
Okay.
But a systemic approach wouldn't just look at that. It would also look at the underlying social and economic pressures, things like poverty, lack of opportunity, educational disparities that might be contributing to crime in the first place.
Yeah.
Seeing the whole picture.
Right, looking at the root causes, the interconnected pressures.
Precisely. And applying this kind of understanding, the source suggests, can guide efforts to build a better world.
How so?
Well, one way is by promoting critical thinking and media literacy. In today's world, saturated with information and persuasive pressures from all sides, the ability to evaluate sources, discern bias, resist manipulation, it's absolutely crucial.
So education needs to focus on how to think.
That's the argument. Education should emphasize how to think critically and analyze these systems of pressure, not just what to think.
Makes sense. What else?
Another major area is designing systems for human well-being. This means consciously trying to create structures, economic, social, technological pressures that are aligned with long-term human interests and sustainability, rather than just reacting to immediate short-term pressures like quarterly profits or convenience. They mention things like sustainable practices, circular economies, regenerative agriculture as examples of designing systems that try to work with natural pressures rather than constantly fighting against them.
Okay.
And the source also raises an interesting, maybe provocative point specifically about governance.
Oh.
It suggests that perhaps things like fixed term limits and maybe even mandatory health or cognitive assessments for leaders in positions of immense power.
Really?
Well, the stated rationale presented in the source is that this could be a way to mitigate the risks associated with the immense pressure of holding power for too long. The idea is to help ensure decisions prioritize the well-being of the populace over, say, the internal pressure an individual might feel to maintain personal power indefinitely. It's presented neutrally as a structural idea worth considering for managing power dynamics under pressure.
That's a really specific structural idea they propose for dealing with the pressures of leadership.
It is, and it comes from applying that systemic thinking to the pressures inherent in concentrated power.
Okay. What else does the source suggest?
It also emphasizes cultivating empathy and compassion. Simply understanding the myriad pressures that other people are facing is fundamental, really, to building supportive and resilient communities.
Seeing things from their perspective, understanding their pressures.
Exactly. And finally, the source underscores the importance of embracing shared humanity. This whole perspective on pressure ultimately reminds us just how interconnected we all are. The big global challenges we face, climate change, inequality, pandemics, they require recognizing our shared vulnerability to these pressures and working together.
For a more just, sustainable, humane future, as they say.
That's the goal outlined.
Yeah.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener, listening right now? I think it means recognizing that pressure isn't just, an occasional stressful event you encounter.
Right.
It's something much more fundamental, a force woven into your biology, your mind, the societies you live in, and maybe even the basic laws of the universe itself.
And understanding this complex web, maybe through this lens of systemic thinking the source talks about, can help you see the forces at play, not just out there in the world, but in your own life and the decisions you make every day.
Yeah. The source kind of leaves us with the idea that the future isn't predetermined. It's a system we're collectively designing, whether we realize it or not.
Yeah.
And this deep dive, hopefully, highlights the incredible range of pressures that are influencing that design process.
So here's a final thought to leave you with, based on the source material. Consider the pressures you feel most acutely right now in your life. Are they natural pressures, like time or basic needs? Are they human-created ones from work or family or society? Or maybe are they a conflict between different pressures pulling you in different directions?
Yeah. What does recognizing those specific pressures tell you?
What does it tell you about the systems you are currently navigating? And maybe, just maybe, how you might navigate them differently. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the science of human pressure.
This is DigitView.